Africa's combined GDP will hit $3.3 trillion in 2026, according to IMF projections. That's larger than India was a decade ago. But here's what most people get wrong about African wealth. The biggest economies aren't the richest countries, and the richest countries aren't growing the fastest. South Africa has the largest GDP, but it's barely growing at 1%. Ethiopia is growing at 7%, but per capita income is under $1,000. And the actual richest Africans? They live in a country most people can't find on a map. This video ranks Africa's 10 largest economies by nominal GDP, then flips the script to show you what the rankings hide, who's actually rising, who's stagnating, and which countries are debt traps disguised as growth stories. For investors, this is your guide to where the opportunities actually are. For Africans, this is the regional competition reshaping the continent. Let's start with the top 10. According to the IMF's October 2025 World Economic Outlook, here are Africa's 10 largest economies. Number 10, Tanzania, around $85 billion. East Africa's quiet riser. Natural gas, tourism, steady industrial growth. Growing at 5.4%, one of the fastest in the top 10. Watch this one. Number 9, Côte d'Ivoire, around $87 billion. The surprise climber, growing at 6.4%, fastest in the top 10. The world's largest cocoa producer is finally processing domestically instead of just exporting beans. Abidjan is becoming a regional financial hub. This is the West African momentum play. Number 8, Angola, around $92 billion. Oil dependent, trying to diversify. Over 90% of exports are still petroleum. Chinese debt looms large, over $40 billion. Angola is a turnaround story if oil stays above $70. Below that, it's a trap. Number 7, Kenya, around $113 billion. East Africa's economic hub. M-Pesa revolutionized mobile money. Nairobi's Silicon Savannah attracts global venture capital. But debt is around 70% of GDP, and recent tax protests showed political limits to austerity. Growth around 4.5%, solid but facing headwinds. Number 6, Ethiopia, around $117 billion. The growth story everyone talks about. 7.2% growth, fastest in sub-Saharan Africa. Ethiopian Airlines is the continent's largest carrier. The Grand Renaissance Dam will transform electricity capacity. But the Tigray conflict damaged investor confidence, and the country went through debt restructuring. High risk, high reward. Number 5, Morocco, around $154 billion. Africa's quiet success story. Automobile manufacturing now rivals tourism. Renault and Peugeot plants ship to Europe. Phosphates dominate global fertilizer supply. Stable governance, strong infrastructure, direct EU market access. For conservative investors, Morocco is the quality play. Now we're into the top 4, the heavyweights accounting for nearly half of Africa's total GDP. Number 4, Nigeria, around $253 billion. This ranking surprises people. Wasn't Nigeria Africa's largest economy? It was, until the naira collapsed over 70% since 2023, crushing GDP in dollar terms. Nigeria still has Africa's largest population at 220 million. Non-oil sectors, fintech, agriculture, telecoms, are finally growing faster than oil. Nigeria is a long-term demographic bet, but currency volatility makes short-term sizing difficult. Number 3, Algeria, around $267 billion. Gas giant. Algeria supplies about 11% of Europe's natural gas. That spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine. But growth is under 3%, and diversification has failed for decades. Gas revenues mask structural problems that will emerge when Europe's energy transition accelerates. Number 2, Egypt, around $347 billion. Strategic geography, Suez Canal revenues alone exceed $9 billion annually. But the currency lost over half its value since 2022. Debt to GDP is around 90%. Interest payments consume nearly 45% of government revenue. That's not sustainable. Gulf states are propping up the budget with over $35 billion. Egypt is too big to fail regionally, but the debt math is ugly. Number 1, South Africa, around $373 billion. Africa's largest economy, but barely growing. GDP growth projected under 1.5%. Load shedding costs billions annually. Unemployment is 33%. But South Africa has deep capital markets, relatively strong rule of law, and sophisticated financial services. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange is Africa's largest. For institutional investors, South Africa remains the gateway to the continent, even if the growth story is disappointing. So that's the top 10 by size. But size isn't wealth. If I asked you which African country has the richest citizens, you'd probably guess South Africa. Or Nigeria, you'd be wrong. The richest Africans by GDP per capita live in Seychelles, 100,000 people in the Indian Ocean. Per capita income, over $21,000. That's higher than Poland. Number 2, Mauritius, around $14,000 per capita. Tourism, financial services, stable governance for decades. Then Botswana at around $7,000. Diamonds, yes, but also decades of sound governance and a sovereign wealth fund. Botswana went from one of the poorest countries at independence to upper middle income, without the corruption that plagued other resource-rich nations. Notice what's missing? Nigeria has per capita income under $1,200. Ethiopia, growing at 7%, has per capita income under $1,000. Egypt has per capita income around $3,500. This is the fundamental tension. The biggest economies often have the poorest citizens because population growth outpaces economic growth. Nigeria's population grows by 5 million per year. The economy needs 7% growth just to keep per capita income flat. It's growing at 3%. For investors, if you want consumer markets, total GDP matters. Nigeria and Egypt have the customers. If you want purchasing power, Mauritius and Botswana have buyers with money to spend. Let me split Africa into 3 categories: sprinters, steady walkers, and stagnators. The sprinters grow above 5% annually. East Africa dominates. Ethiopia at 7.2%, Rwanda at 7.1%, Tanzania at 5.4%, Côte d'Ivoire at 6.4%. These economies could double in size within 10 to 12 years. But growth comes with caveats. Ethiopia went through debt restructuring. Rwanda is tiny in absolute terms. The steady walkers grow 3 to 5%. Kenya at 4.5%. Ghana recovering after its debt crisis. Morocco around 3%. Then the stagnators. South Africa under 1.5%. Hamstrung by electricity failures. Angola barely positive. Egypt constrained by debt servicing. Here's the projection. By 2030, Côte d'Ivoire could crack the top 5, overtaking Morocco. Tanzania could overtake Kenya. South Africa's share of continental GDP keeps shrinking, from over 20% a decade ago to around 11% now. The center of gravity is shifting. Southern Africa is stagnating. East and Francophone. West Africa are rising. Before you get excited about growth stories, here are the rankings that matter most for risk. Sudan is over 200% debt to GDP, effectively insolvent. Zambia exceeded 100% and just finished painful restructuring in 2024. Egypt is around 90%. Ghana was over 100% before restructuring. But the scariest number isn't debt to GDP. It's interest payments as a share of revenue. Egypt spends nearly 45% of government revenue on interest payments. Not debt repayment, just interest. Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Angola, all spending 25 to 35% on interest. That's money not going to infrastructure, education, or healthcare. Here's the alarming statistic. 30 African countries spend more on debt interest than on public health. Debt service could reach $89 billion in 2025. That's the real cost of the Africa premium. Borrowing at 10% when developed nations, borrow at 2%. High growth with high debt is a warning sign. The math matters more than the headlines. Tier 1, lower risk, moderate returns. Morocco and Botswana. Stable governance, diversified economies, manageable debt. Won't deliver explosive returns, but won't blow up either. Tier 2, moderate risk, higher potential. Kenya and Côte d'Ivoire. Both have debt concerns, but genuine growth drivers. Kenya's tech ecosystem is real. Côte d'Ivoire is the West African momentum play. Tier 3, higher risk, highest potential. Ethiopia and Tanzania. Fastest growth, but governance questions and limited capital market access. You need a long-time horizon. Tier 4, giants with issues. Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa. Too big to ignore? Too problematic to overweight? Nigeria is a demographic bet if reforms stick. Egypt needs debt restructuring or continued Gulf bailouts. South Africa is a value trap until Eskom is fixed. What to avoid? Single commodity dependence with high debt. That's Angola. That's pre-restructuring Zambia. That's potentially Egypt if Gulf support dries up. Africa's $3.3 trillion economy is larger than it's ever been, but the growth isn't evenly distributed. The traditional powers, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, face structural headwinds. The rising economies, Ethiopia, Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania, have momentum but also vulnerabilities. The richest Africans don't live in the biggest economies. The fastest growing economies aren't necessarily the best investments. And debt means many growth stories end in restructuring rather than prosperity. For Western investors, Africa is 54 countries with radically different risk profiles. Blanket. Africa exposure is lazy. Pick your spots based on governance, debt sustainability, and competitive advantage. For African investors and diaspora, East Africa and Francophone. West Africa are rising while Southern Africa stagnates. The opportunities are there, but so are the traps. Rankings tell you size. Growth rates tell you momentum. Debt levels tell you sustainability. You need all three. Next week, Egypt versus Ethiopia, the $30 billion GERD dam showdown, and why investors are pricing war risk into Egyptian bonds. Subscribe for African economic intelligence before mainstream media catches up. I'll see you in the next one.